Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you let us know where you think we got it right and where we completely got it wrong, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com. Let's get into it. So, what do you want to chat about today, Brian?
Well, I think it's important that we talk about, this tendency we have or pattern we have or whatever you want to call it, that we fall into this tribalistic approach to things. And you've mentioned it, as you've traveled abroad, you've seen it in, Greece and Macedonia. And, we of course had it during the Civil War, and we of course had it, in other periods of history. And, to a greater extent than I've ever experienced it in my lifetime, we're certainly having it now.
Oh yeah.
So what's the reason? How do we contract and expand like an accordion, where we go from, I would disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it, to, get off my lawn. How do we do that?
Well,
why do we do that?
I think to some extent, I was thinking about this after our last episode. To some extent, I think it comes down to the volume by which all conversation happens now, and it happens in crisis eras. And by volume, I mean the level of angst, the level of how loudly we proclaim the things we believe, and that just drives people into a place of comfort, which is their own people. In the times when you could disagree with somebody without being disagreeable, to use that old phrase, people could have a discussion about something and they didn't yell at each other, right? They didn't scream at each other. But today, there's not too much that isn't a them's are fighting words topic, right? I mean,
right.
Everything's recently people were getting upset about Taylor Swift in the NFL. So for Kenny G, the NFL is a thing we do in our age, where people go run at each other and throw each other on the ground and chase pigskins. And Taylor Swift is somebody who sings a lot of songs. So there you go. Yeah. Look it up. It's interesting.
I almost had my thing that I'm glad Kenny G will never have to experience, was arguing over Taylor Swift and if the NFL's rigged or not.
Yes, exactly. This is a sure sign of the apocalypse.
Arguing over her and how long her relationship with her boyfriend, and if she's going to run for president. Like it's so odd that the severity of problems, like we really have problems.
Yeah.
But this is like, if there was still a newspaper, it'd be like front page news.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Anything. Yeah. Or the fact that she flies her own private airplane. If I was a super rich person, I'd fly in my own private airplane. I don't care what anybody 100%. Says. Give me a break. But that really is the age that we're in, where everything becomes a topic that we argue about, and so therefore, if the noise out there is so loud, then I think people naturally are going to retreat into groups of people that think the way they do, that say things the way they do, just for self-defense. I think that's part of the problem with it. I think that's part of why tribalism rears its ugly head every crisis era.
Yeah. I kind of, as you're talking through that, I kind of, in the Taylor Swift thing, is kind of a funny example, but it's an example nonetheless. I guess I'm kind of looking at this now, thinking through it on the fly, of legitimate reasons to fall into tribalism versus illegitimate reasons to fall into tribalism.
Absolutely.
So for example, there's things that we don't, that it doesn't make sense, or a logical person would say we shouldn't really get tribalistic about that. And that's much of how I grew up. It was odd to have the uncle or the friend's parent, and these aren't real examples, just like hypothetical examples, but you would no doubt encounter the person who just took like arguments over taxes way too serious, right?
Yes. Yeah,
and they made it tribalistic, but nobody else did. Like, it was just like they were the fringe person for like being really wrapped up into this one topic that you're like, yeah, I understand we have a difference of opinion. I understand it's got consequences, but it's not what you're making it, right?
Sure, exactly.
Versus, you look at the Civil War, like the values that were being fought there, I would argue were worth being fought over. And easy for me to say as a guy who didn't die in the Civil War, but the cost of 600,000 lives was a worthy expense in my opinion. Again, easy for me to say, and I get that. I'm not overlooking that part. Easy for me to say. I think there is a real difference in the things that we ought to be tribalistic over and the things we ought not to be tribalistic over. And up until recently, I don't think I really had a handle on the likelihood in my lifetime that there would be things that would be on the scale of Jews dying in gas camps and Auschwitz and the Civil War. And I just, it didn't occur to me that stuff could plausibly be something that I would encounter in my own life. It felt to me like we had evolved or whatever past that.
Sure.
And now to experience it and seeing like some things that people are, I would argue not legitimately, they're not legitimate reasons to get tribalistic.
Right.
Like Hillary Clinton lost the election and therefore the world's going to end. Right. Versus things that are worth being tribalistic over. Using an example, I just saw an image today that kind of made me think of this is, right now the federal government is fighting with Texas to take down razor wire to keep, tens of thousands of people per day in some cases from coming over our border. So razor wire is bad in that context. But when you back up to, January 12th, 2021, razor wire was all around the Capitol and razor wire was totally cool then.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's protecting the people in the legislature. So razor wire was not a big deal. It's who's being protected that we're fighting over. And that is something I think is worthy of being tribalistic over.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think you hit a really important point there, and that is what is worth being tribalistic over and what is the size of the tribe. In other words, when I was growing up, when you and I were growing up, the big tribe that we were all part of is we're Americans. And, God, country, and apple pie, right? Just that we had certain general agreements that, freedom was a good thing. And the way that the oppression of the Soviet Union was a bad thing. So there was a tribe where there was us and them in that massive tribe. There were, crime is a bad thing, no matter who does it. And being a law abiding, upstanding citizen is a good thing. So we had a general, large scale tribe and people. And just to be clear about this, people organize into tribes for very, very good reasons. I mean, the reasons that original humans, however long ago that was, went to tribes is for self-protection. We all sort of live in the same area. Maybe if we band together, we can keep animals and other folks and people that are going to want to take our stuff from doing bad things to us. So tribalism on a properly applied basis is not a bad thing. It's just when it becomes
necessary.
It's necessary. Yeah, it's survival. It's survival. Yeah. I mean, the ultimate tribe is a society that organizes into a government, has a government and a societal component, and that's a very good thing. But when it becomes a bad thing is when we become so stovepiped that your tribe is only people that look like you, only people that hold your particular narrow view in a particular thing, and we become these tiny little tribes everywhere that are willing to fight for things that are not necessarily survival things or basic things. That's, I think, where we're at right now. We fight for the sake of fighting to a great extent, and it becomes very destructive to the big tribe, to the overall tribe of, for instance, in our case, the United States of America.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see how the tribe that has power, what is commonly at this moment in time being called the elites and phrases like that, appear to, and my diagnosis and other folks' perception of this could be off for sure, but it really appears as though that tribe really has contempt for another tribe, which is has not gone to the right colleges or the right length of college, or does not have the right degrees, or does not have the right understanding of finance, and does, unattractive things like cleaning your carpets and driving a semi
Right.
truck
Yeah.
and putting siding on houses and things. And while the tribe that does those, more laborious, more blue collar kind of, generally, not always, there's, doctors and stuff who kind of fit more in that blue collar realm and things like that as far as how they see themselves, but they might not, they might kind of scoff and laugh at the quote unquote elites for living in a bubble that, they couldn't take care of themselves for 6 months, for example. That's kind of
Right.
laughable, but they don't
Sure.
have contempt for them. They don't wish them real harm. They don't see them as a necessary evil. They don't and again, there's exceptions to this for sure. Like that, I'm talking like 80-20 rule here, right?
Sure.
Versus the other tribe that has this kind of condescending view. It's odd that they have this disdain for people who allow for the lifestyle that they have. And
Yeah.
so that's an example of why I look at like a tribalism that doesn't make sense. It's not warranted on it's not based, I should say, upon self-preservation. It's the opposite of that, actually.
Yeah.
Their self-preservation is relying upon these people putting siding on houses and growing food and driving semi trucks to deliver it to their house, but they hate them anyway.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, because it's an unnecessary tribalism based on sort of an emotional superiority complex,
Right.
this type of thing. If you don't think like I do, if you even consider things different than I consider, then you're less of a human being than
Right.
I am.
And now it's even morphed beyond that, where it's not even we argue over the thing, we argue over whether or not your point should even be considered because you have
That's
this
right.
lesser degree of education, or you have this bias, this weird bias where you think you should not consider race when factoring every decision in, and you should
Right.
not consider who the oppressor and who the oppressed is, and things that, again, 15-20 years ago we would have said he would have been the weird uncle or my friend's
Right.
parent who took things too far.
Yeah.
And now that is a much bigger force. I don't know if it's in volume, as in number of people, percentage of the population,
Right.
or force meaning the few people who have just tremendous levers of power at their disposal to impose this idea or these concepts on people. It's rubbing against people's values, which is a word I keep using over and over
Yeah.
again. And I'm sure people are tired of hearing about it, but it's not ideas, it's not goals, it's values. It's the things that people would die for, and they're
Right.
or to fight or to protect their kids from or whatever. And these are things that people will absolutely find themselves in smaller and smaller communities, because that stuff matters more than the things that they ought to do or the things that they're told that they should do and things like that. And in a little bit we'll get into more. I'll give a more better description of what I'm talking about, but it really feels to me like, again, going back and looking at the Civil War and using Germany as an example and these kinds of big events, when their values are at odds, they will fight, versus when ideas about how laws should be applied or how laws should be written, or um, when there's a balance of a perceived balance of fairness, there's a
Yeah.
perceived balance of duty versus entitlement. There's a perceived balance that people go, yeah, I'm losing this one, but I'm winning the other one. So who cares? In the big scheme of things, it's all going to work. It's all going to work itself out. When that goes away and that balance is gone, and now there's a tremendous feeling of unfairness, for example, or you know, uh, of losing basic things that we, again, 15 years ago thought were the most important things that made our country special, which was every person can work their ass off and become whatever they want to be.
Right.
That entire idea is being challenged now, and that is a value that we've had collectively, and roughly half the population is saying kiss my ass. I'm not going along with that.
Right. Well, yeah, and it gets back to some in previous episodes we talked about the role of religion in society when the tribal when the tribal entity and the tribal ethos and its values, as you're talking about, become at the level of God's commands, And therefore, if you are not part of this tribe, you are just the same as, in religious circles, they say anathema. You're a blasphemer. You're a person of that we should shut up. You can't say these things. You're not supposed to say these things, as opposed to like the conservative liberal kind of debate that happened over years. The entire time that I was growing up was, the bleeding heart liberal versus the uncaring conservative, and that
right.
kind of distinction. It was like, well,
Heartless.
Heartless conservative. But it was really the two could talk, though, because they were on a spectrum. At least it's like, no, if you're doing these things, you're taking too much power to the government, and that's going to hurt people in the end, the people that you're trying to help. And so there was this idea, or the reverse. It's like, well, if you don't give as much to the government, then the people you're trying to help aren't ever going to get help. So there was this kind of continuum. But when you have such distinct tribal separation as we have today between, and you could pick 14 or 15 different labels and pit them one against another. There's no continuum at all at that point. There's no common ground. And that's when you have breakdown, is when there's no common ground, no way to have a discussion about, we both want to get to the same place. We just have different means to get to the same place.
Yeah. One of the things that I've seen that illustrates this really well, I think. So, again, for years, I grew up around people who had a wide variety of religious beliefs, from atheists to devout Christians or whatever faith they had. And people just coexisted because they and I don't mean coexisted in the goofy bumper sticker way, but they coexisted in that nobody that I knew believed that they had the right to tell somebody else what to believe.
Right.
So they would say, like, I'm following the path of my heart and what I think is right because I have this faith that compels me to do that. And I need to act a certain way to act in alignment with my faith and my values, although they wouldn't have said the word values, but it applies. And that person has every right to do their faith and or lack thereof and follow their heart and do what they want to do. The difference now is, I think, that the people who don't have a theologic based value system. So I'm not saying people who are churchgoers. I'm not saying people who are devout Christians or Jews or Muslims. I'm just saying that they have values that align with a traditional Judeo-Christian belief system. The people who are not in alignment with that idea now, not only do they scoff and minimize those people for having those traditional Judeo-Christian beliefs, but they go further and say, because I am the more educated, I am the more righteous, I am the more enlightened person, I'm actually more powerful than your God.
Right.
And I am actually a bigger entity in the big scheme of things because I'm so enlightened than your God is. So it's completely diminishing. It's not even that they're arguing like whether or not there's an afterlife, for example. They're not arguing that. They're minimizing the person's ability to have a credible say in the matter because there's such rubes that they believe in this thing when I'm more powerful than that stupid God you believe in. I know more than this thing you pray to. Like, in what universe would a book that was written 2,000 years ago have more accuracy or more legitimacy than things I think now with all the education we've amassed since then? And that is where people are willing to fight in a different way because you're rubbing up against their values, not against ideas that are more inconsequential.
Right. And once you have no common values, it becomes difficult to have reconciliation. That's now that is, as we've discussed, this idea of crisis eras and rebuilding eras and all this. It is true that eventually there come common values when things get bad enough, so that the common values are forced upon us, such as eating, living, surviving, having electricity, having food.
Duty and entitlement is going to be a great example of that. I think it'll be like, as I've explained before, like the rubber band thing where you leave the crisis era of World War II and there's a high regard for duty.
Right.
And not a high regard for people who talk about duty. There's a high regard for people who perform duty. And over the course of the last 80 or 90 years, that rubber band has stretched where now the value is placed upon who talks the best about duty,
Right.
but doesn't actually perform the duty. But in the blink of an eye, within a few months, that will revert all the way back to just like it was in 1944 before the end of World War II, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And all it will matter is what you do about duty, not what you say about duty. And that value system will be snapped back faster than we will even be able to comprehend it, I think.
Yeah, well, it's happened before. I mean, it's what's happened over and over and over, whether you talk about, World War II or the Civil War or the Revolutionary War or the War of the Roses in England. You just keep going back in time, and that happens over and over. We have to eventually return to human basic reality to survive, and we don't have the luxury in those eras of having big disagreements about, gender roles or whatever else, because we're too busy trying to figure out if our kids are going to survive.
Perfectly a few weeks ago, we can't afford those conversations anymore. We can afford them when things are going really well.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you can't afford those conversations because, the hierarchy of needs dictates that we don't afford those conversations.
Well, and so it's interesting that if you think about it, it's interesting. You start off in a sort of a rebuilding era, like after the Civil War or after World War II. And you still have tribalism, but it's one big tribe. It's just like we were talking about earlier. You have a big tribe, and then various people, they rub shoulders with other people, and they're well, those people, I don't really like what they think about this or that or the other thing. And then you've got the 60s, and you've got the flower children, and we don't want to hang out with the square people, and so you've got this, and then we're in the 80s, we got the punk rockers that, so you keep going down the road. And you keep fragmenting more and more and more because everybody wants to be different.
Dave? Were you more Bee Gees or Vanilla Ice? Where did you land?
I was half Barry Gibb and half, but Vanilla Ice is a real estate guy now, so I can identify with him. So it's, he's a business guy now.
So funny that in a 10-year period we went from the Bee Gees to Vanilla Ice.
Oh yeah, exactly. But
Kenny's, I hope you look up at least who the Bee Gees are. Vanilla Ice you can probably forget about, but the Bee Gees you got to know who those are.
Cultural classic. Yeah. Well, it's funny as you watch too. I think a lot of those generational tribal differences do show up in the music. they show up in the musical 100%. Styles.
It's so fascinating to just again picking up post World War II and just looking at every 3 to 6 years how quote unquote pop music evolved from Glenn, what was his name, In the Mood,
Glenn Miller. Yeah.
All the way through, Motley Crue and
Black Sabbath.
just every few years it changed. It's wild to just kind of see, which again fuels my theory that part of our problem is we just always want the new thing. We always want the next best new thing.
That's it. And we don't want to be our parents.
Right. Yeah, and so as these crises begin to unfold, and we start bumping into more deeper issues. So, for example, I kind of have it broken down in my mind. Again, I've not done any research on this, and I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist, so I take it for what it's worth, right? But I kind of look at this like we have internal things that make us do things. We have external things that make us do things, right? So in an external sense, we have things that we ought to do. There's suggested obligations. We ought to be kind to people. If we see some garbage on the ground, we ought to pick it up and put it in the garbage can. We ought to treat people the way we want to be treated, et cetera, right? Those are kind of things that we ought to do that are socially put upon us.
Right.
And then there's things that external, that's an external thing we ought to do. Then there's external things that we must do or should do, which are things like laws.
Yeah.
And there's varying degrees. Like you shouldn't jaywalk, but if nobody's looking and there's nobody around, like plenty of people jaywalk.
Yeah.
You shouldn't speed. Well, I don't know, somewhere around 87% of the population probably speeds every single day, something like that, right? And then there's more serious laws, of course, where you get it all the way up to manslaughter and murder and like horrific things that are things that you must do that are put upon you externally.
Yeah.
And then there's things that are internal things that we ought to do. We have goals. We have things that we ought to do because it will make us feel good or make our life better or whatever. But then we have these values. We have these things that we must do.
Yeah.
And those are things that we will fight over.
Yeah.
And those are things that are more important than death and more important than the safety of our family. There's values people hold that are so strong. I mean, again, going back to World War II in Nazi Germany and place,
Yeah.
we talked about the Von Trapp family in The Sound of Music. They had a luxurious lifestyle, but their values were such that they were willing to risk all the lives of all them and their children, all that was worth it, to live a life in alignment with their values.
Yeah.
And so, backing up 40 years ago, the things we disagreed about were things that we ought to do.
Yeah.
And the things that we're disagreeing about now are things that we must do. But we have different things that we must do. Some people must ensure an equal outcome for everyone,
Right.
and other people must ensure an equal opportunity for everyone.
Right.
There's no bridge to get to bring that gap together. And these are values that people will absolutely fight over. And so what are they going to do? They're going to find like-minded people, and they're going to build a tribe of people who think like they do and value what they do,
Right.
because it is self-preservation. And
Yep.
at the end of the crisis, just like the guy who, the Muslim guy who said that, Islam was the religion of peace, and they asked him in Guantanamo Bay, how could it be the religion of peace? He says, well, when everyone's been killed, converted, or enslaved, there'll be peace.
Exactly.
And that's how it happened in World War II. And that's how it happened in the Civil War. People were either converted or killed.
Yep.
And the ones who were left all shared the same values again.
Well, and now there's another V word that plays into that, and your illustration of the Guantanamo terrorist goes right to that. So it's values, but it's also vision.
Right.
It's vision, because if you have a vision of the world and you're willing to fight to the death for your vision of the world, then and your vision of the world is different than somebody else's vision of the world, and they're willing to fight to the death for their vision of the world, then, and of course the values and the vision, they have to be in alignment to be logical. But the vision of the world that says there's nobody who is not Islamic in the world, that's a vision. And so therefore, in service of that vision, we've seen in the Middle East people in service of that vision doing things that we who don't hold that vision think are just horrific. The October 7th attacks in Israel, or other things,
stoning women to death, for crying out loud.
Right. I mean, just things from
barbaric in our standards.
The American, the common, at least it was, the common American vision of the world is more egalitarian, in that is that you as an individual, you can believe this, or you can believe this, or you can believe this. But just as long as you leave everybody else alone and you pursue what you want without hurting other people, you're probably okay. I mean, that might be an extreme libertarian view, but it's a general view of how the West has thought about things. That there's certain things that you don't kill, you don't steal. These are things that are part of our vision of what a good world looks like. Now, if you take a more conservative approach to it, you look at a world and say, my vision of the world is one in which there's no child that is killed for there's no child that's killed by another human being from conception to the time that they die of natural causes. So there's a vision as well, and that vision then we've had in our local news now just some people that were convicted of violating the FACE act, in which they were convicted of protesting in front of an abortion clinic. Well, they were willing for their vision of the world, in which no child is killed by a doctor, to sacrifice their own freedom and their own lives. So the vision and the values, those two things together, are then what you have to create a tribe. And depending on how strong those vision and those values are, depends on how perhaps maybe militant you could say that tribe gets in its opposition to tribes that don't hold that vision.
Yeah. I would argue it's not all that much different, if at all. And I have not really spent a lot of time thinking about it, so I don't know. But when you and I a few weeks back were talking about the definition of a religion, I suspect that that the things a tribe would come to agree upon would be pretty much the same as a congregation.
Yes,
and they would have an agreed upon idea of evil or a villain. They would have an agreed upon vision shaped by their values. Like all this stuff would be very congruent. And so when as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, like my belief is that if you're looking at kind of the risk board, or looking at battles that happen. The Alamo will be people's values.
Yes,
they will shrink down that, and that will be the last thing that they will not sacrifice. That they would rather die than sacrifice that.
Yeah.
The outposts, the tax code, and the property taxes, and things that the government does that are not about values, that are more about dollars and things like
Sure.
that those outposts, they'll sacrifice those in the war and not really think much of it. It's like, yeah, it sucks we lost that, but whatever. In the big scheme of things, we got bigger fish to fry. But there's certain things that they just will not give up on. And it feels like some of that is just human nature. Again, you and I talked about the cyclicality of this stuff. Like we just talked about with popular music. Like there's no such thing as the music from 1978 being deemed like this is the music from here on out. Like that's not how it works. It's 7 years later and 4 years later, there was different kinds of music. Yep. It's always got to be something different. And people always want their way, and they always want people to do what they want, and they always want to put out the least amount of effort, and they always have a reason why they should be able to retaliate or foist their ideas upon somebody.
Sure.
And so it doesn't take a whole lot of nudging, I don't think, to get people to go down this road. But there's nudging happening also.
Yeah. Well, now think about this too. We're talking about the core values and sort of the ancillary values. But I think one of the things that happens is when you've got core values, you establish a tribe around those core values, then those ancillary things we're talking about, like property taxes or, government regulation or something like that, that on their own, they wouldn't have been a core value. But what happens when that ancillary value is on your side, anybody from the other side that attacks this ancillary value that you happen to hold, all of a sudden that secondary or tertiary or 4 or 5, pieces down the road, it starts to become much, much more important. And so it's like, my core value is human life. But as a conservative, I also believe in low taxes. And so therefore, if you don't believe in low taxes, then you're just as bad as an abortionist. So the tribalism starts with something here, but it expands throughout the entire belief system. And this is what happens this happens in religions as well. I mean, in religions, for most of, since the Protestant Reformation happened, you had people that were arguing and literally fighting over the form of baptism. So should you baptize an adult or should you baptize? You baptize children, you heathen, you're just like, Molech, so.
Well, and like using the Islam thing as an example, let's say that guy in Guantanamo got his wish and Islam was the only religion in the world. Well, pretty soon you would have factions and sects that would say it must be this strict adherence. Others would say a more liberal adherence. It's just human nature that it's always gonna be conflict over this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that like what you're describing were these things that began as ancillary things begin to have more weight. I was picturing in my head, like, imagine you had a neighbor who was stealing firewood out from your backyard, and you knew, like, you had video of them, like, you knew it was them. There was no question it was them. And then they came along and their kid was selling Girl Scout cookies. Well, you'd be damned if you're going to buy that kid's Girl Scout cookies, not because you don't want the kid to sell Girl Scout cookies, but because screw that person, they're stealing your firewood.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't give a crap what they want. They can't have I'm not going to support them and help them be successful because they're doing this other atrocious thing.
Right.
And we link all these things to these ancillary things, and it becomes a battle that if we give them an inch, and we keep giving them an inch, there's no indication that they're going to stop, because they have proven that they are willing to fight over these values. And it's almost like it feels to me, having lived through this in the last few years, like almost like a collective subconscious slowly coming to grips with the fact that there is no stopping. This is not a pendulum. This is a linear movement. And we, whether it doesn't matter which side you're on, we on both sides feel equally. We've given plenty and we've given up and we've given all we can, and they just won't stop. Therefore, we can't give them their Girl Scout cookies now because they're stealing our firewood.
It's the Hatfields and the McCoys. You remember that old that, and well, they shot at me yesterday. Well, you shot at them the day before. Yeah, but they shot at us the day before. Well, who started it? Well, we don't know who started it, but all I know is I hate them, and that's good enough. And they're shooting at me.
Wasn't it started over like a hog that got killed or something like that?
It was some like insignificant farm thing.
And then the daughter had been married off, and there was from one family. It was so insignificant how that started, and the next thing you know, like sons and brothers were getting murdered,
shooting each other, killing each other. Exactly.
Yeah.
Isn't that human nature? Isn't that the whole thing about human? I mean, if you go back to, if you look at it in biblical terms, you go back to the original family fight, Cain and Abel. Cain is upset because God likes Abel's offering better. Well, what do you mean you like his offering better? And so he kills them. I mean, so this is human nature from the very, very beginning. And a lot of it's pride, I think. I mean, we want to be right. We want to be viewed by other people as, smart, worthwhile, all these positive things.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Therefore, when they disagree with us on one thing, then we retreat to our tribe and we plan our attack. So that's,
when you were just talking about that, like the things that you mentioned, we want to be seen as worthy. What was the other word you used? Something like right. And
right.
And
worthy. We want to have pride in what we do and have other people.
As you were saying, it reminded me of this experiment they did with mice, where they took a starving mouse and they put it in a tube. And in the front, it was like a U-shaped tube where the mouse was horizontal, and there was tubes that went down one in front of it, one behind it, that went down in kind of looked like a U-shape, upside down U, and the mouse was in the horizontal part. And a starving mouse, and they wafted up a smell of like food, and the mouse was like tied or strung or somehow attached to a thing so they can measure the force and energy it exerted to try to get the food. It was a starving mouse.
Right.
And they measured that. And then they took the smell of a cat and wafted it up the tube behind it. Now, which one of those do you think the mouse put out the most energy? The smell of pursuing the food or getting away from the cat?
Getting away from the cat. Yeah, getting away from the cat.
Yeah. So getting away from the cat was a much stronger impulse, and much more energy went into getting away from the cat, because we will flee things we fear more than we pursue things we like. So you keeping that in mind, and the things you talked about are the fears that people have the deepest. I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. People don't like me. These are real fears. And when pushed into a corner, those are things that they will absolutely fight for. And fight to gain. They will put much more energy into fleeing things that they fear than they will pursuing things that they want.
And think about the things that they fear that drive them into tribes, right? So if I stand here and I say, this is true, and everybody around me says, no, you're an idiot, this is not true. Well, okay, that's one thing. If I stand in a group of 100 people and everybody in a group of 100 people says, this is true, then I don't feel exposed. I'm not exposed as an idiot anymore, because, well, everybody, it's the wolf pack mentality, right? I mean,
and if all my college friends say that God is stupid and these truck drivers are a bunch of rubes, and I stand up and say, no, they're just people who have different beliefs as me, I will not be as righteous as them. I will be unliked. I'll be unloved. I'll be shunned. I'll be the pariah. I'll be alone because the truck drivers don't want me either.
Right. Yes, exactly. Well, and so that I think that leads to a lot of tribal adoption. In other words, when people, and what was it, 2020, when everybody's out in the streets and, tearing up cities and marching and all that stuff during the summer. Probably, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 10 people could really explain in an in-depth way, in an intellectual way. I'm sure they had the talking points down, but I'm sure that probably not very many people in that group could really explain what they're there for. And that's the case with most mobs, with most large protests, where you get 1 million people out there. A small percentage of the folks that are there can really articulate beyond just a few slogans what they're there for. They just want to belong. They just want to belong. They want to be part of the cool kids. And, I'm sure you see this in business a lot. I see this in business a lot, where I see people that will choose to do business with certain people, not because they've got the best price or the best offering, but because they're the respected ones in the industry. They're the cool kids. And so it's human nature. It applies to,
just look at what percentage of unhappy marriages are because people are afraid to be alone.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
People who marry poorly or stay in bad relationships because it's better than being alone.
Yeah.
And so, these things they're interesting until the moment we're in arrives. And again, I'm not like rooting for this to happen. I'm not hoping this happens, but I also don't want to be blind to it. And to me, it as awful as it was in the Civil War, and as awful as it was in World War II, and as awful as it was in the Revolutionary War, like the pattern is just too consistent.
Yeah.
It seems exceedingly unlikely at this point, looking at how we appear to be, opposing forces going head on for each other with very different outcomes, very different values driving it, and people willing to do pretty gnarly things to each other because of this tribalism we're talking about. So it's not a matter of like rooting for it. It's just a matter of trying to understand it. And like, how do we navigate it? And how do we minimize it? And as it relates to the tribalism thing, I don't know. Part of me just is kind of resigned to the fact, like, there's been people a lot smarter than me that have lived throughout history. And if they couldn't figure it out, I don't know that my feeble brain's going to be able to figure it out. I don't know how you could, again, going back to example we used a couple weeks ago, if you're playing Monopoly with 6 people and 3 of them think that the way it's supposed to be played is everybody starts with the same amount of money, and the other 3 think the way it's supposed to be played is everybody ends with the same amount of money, the Monopoly board is going to get thrown in the air at some point, and there's going to be a fist fight probably, right? Yeah. If you have a husband who believes it's okay because women are a second-class citizen to smack his wife around a little bit, and the wife doesn't agree with that, they have different values,
right?
That's not going to be a very harmonious lifestyle.
No.
If you have one spouse who believes that an open marriage is cool and another one that does not think an open marriage is cool,
it's not going to work very well.
It doesn't matter what kind of car they drive. The values are going to be at conflict, and everything is going to suck because of that. And it just it feels like we're careening towards that. And as we sit here and talk through it, it's like it kind of all makes perfect sense, even though that's not great news. You know what I mean?
Well, you're right. And I think the point of this discussion and the point of thinking about these things for us and for Kenny G in the future is not so that we can solve them. These are not things where we're going to come up, Brian and Dave, or any 1,000 scholars that are 10 times more smarter than we are, or we're not going to solve them. What we have to do, you mentioned it earlier, we have to figure out how we're going to navigate these times. And I think that's for Kenny G in the future. Assuming this podcast survives and he's listening to it in the future, then the advice for him is to say, okay, you see what's coming. You see the bear coming at you. You're not going to stop the bear. The bear's coming. It's on its way. Right. You're not going to stop it. What you have to figure out is, what do you do next? And the other thing, like for me, when I think about these times here too, is I have to think about, well, what do I want to fight? And what do I want to not fight? In other words, there are, I don't want to just sit back and say, I'm not going to do anything that, would resist the trend of history. So I don't want to do that. It's back to your example that you used a number of times about, I don't want to live, a mile from Auschwitz and not do something about it. Right.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to figure out, what can I do? How can I navigate this time and the circumstances, realizing you're not going to just march up to the gate and say, hi, I'm here, throw down your guns. Okay, well, that's the end of you, right? I mean, so I think that's where wisdom comes in. Wisdom comes in to say, not necessarily that I want to build my tribe the most. Maybe what I want to do is I want to. And there's a science fiction story that escapes me right now, but it talks. Oh no, it's the Foundation series. Did you read Foundation by Isaac Asimov? Okay, well, so without going into the whole thing, one of the main protagonists says, "Look, bad times are coming. It could be 1,000 years or it can be 100 years. Let's work hard to make sure it's only 100 years. So not avoiding the bad times, but rather minimizing the negative impact of the inevitable that we're facing. And I think that's what we have to do in our day and age. I think that's what Kenny G has to do in his day and age. And as this cycle repeats itself on, 80, 90, 100-year cycles from now until Jesus comes, we have to just be able to navigate it in such a way that we do as much good as possible, not fight unwinnable battles, and know the difference. We have to have the wisdom to know the difference between those two things, and make a positive difference to save as many people.
So you're saying we should live the Serenity Prayer is what you're saying.
What's that?
You're saying we should live the Serenity Prayer.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. It's it's better than the alternative, right? Exactly right.
Yeah. I hope I do hope that we evolve through these things.
Yeah.
I'm less confident now than I was a year ago, for sure, though.
Yeah.
I see indications that although we choose the victims, the heroes, the scapegoats, and the villains differently, meaning what we used to it was more collectively okay to look down upon people for being black, for example, in Mississippi in 1940, where now in New York City or Baltimore or Chicago, it's okay to look down on people for being white.
Yeah.
The criteria has changed, but it's the same exact methodology.
Yeah.
And I used to really think that this was kind of like a pendulum that didn't have a motor driving it, and eventually we would stop and maybe pointing like true north. We would kind of work its way out, and it would lose energy, and it would just we'd kind of all go, well, hey, we've learned all this stuff, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. It feels like there's fuel being added to it, which is maybe that nudging. Maybe there's people who want enough power and that's all it takes, a little bit of nudging, a little bit of gasoline on the fire to really stoke things up and prevent that these ideas that it's okay to have a different set of rules for somebody based on what color their skin is, or it's okay to have a different set of rules for somebody based on things that they can't control, and those things they can't control matter more than their character, for example, and whatever. I really used to think that this was like a pendulum just running out of energy, and now it just doesn't feel that way. I just there's more indicators every week, I would say, not exaggerating, like every week to show me. And again, I have my bias. Maybe I'm looking for things that aren't there. Hell, I don't know. But there's enough things to show me like this is gaining energy in this moment, not in the big scheme of things. It's not, but in this moment, it's gaining energy, not losing energy, which is wild to me. I never would have imagined that we would kind of go backwards in time on some of this stuff.
Well, I think in the aspirational side of me would hope that your vision would come true, but I don't think it will. And I'll tell you why. Because that aspirational side would require, for it to run out of energy, for the pendulum to run out of energy, it would mean that we have to depend primarily on knowledge and wisdom and learning to sap the energy out of it. Now, I think the reason it becomes re-energized and the pendulum starts swinging more wildly every, 80 or so years, or, on a continually, widening arc, as time goes on, is because we don't put as much emphasis on that. There's more emphasis on human emotion and human nature and human nature drives. It's the drives that drive every one of us, that drove the formation of tribes 10,000 years ago, that drove the formation of elites when they were barons and lords, and when they're now hedge fund managers and senators. It's that human nature component of it that I think kind of rewinds up that thing that drives the pendulum. If it were knowledge, then yes, we would, because we've learned. I mean, when you compare modern society to 100 years, 1,000 years ago, we're brilliant. We're bloody brilliant.
Yeah.
We're all Einsteins.
Yeah.
But we're morons because we keep doing the same things over that are wrong and keep hurting ourselves.
Well, I think that what the pendulum loses energy after we come out of this crisis, because we're all engaged and we were like, we're collectively say we're not going to let that happen again.
Right.
We will not let Auschwitz happen again. We will
Yep.
not let slavery happen again. And then the generations die off, and it becomes more about, well, I don't have to worry about that. Somebody else is taking care of that. And our energy gets diverted to other things that are not making sure that pendulum doesn't get wound up again.
Right.
And then as we abdicate that responsibility and we give away, we empower people who we think have our best interests in mind, eventually you're going to find greedy people and selfish people and people who will profit off of things like people being sick and dying in wars and things like that. And those people can wind that motor right back up.
That's right.
And we're oblivious to it for the first 20, 30, 40 years probably.
Yeah.
Until we start bumping into real values conflicts instead of these tax codey kind of conflicts and gerrymandering conflicts that are, it's a pain in the ass. I don't like losing that, but whatever. I still have a nicer house than 97% of the population on the planet because we live in the greatest country it's ever been or whatever. And then behind the scenes, that stuff is getting ratcheted up and it's happening for years or decades before we're even aware that motor got wound up again. And then once it starts really violating our values, then that's when people will eventually say enough.
Well, part of the problem is that we overestimate our own progress. So if you go from the 40s to the 60s, in the 60s, there was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. We had won World War II. We had become the most powerful country on the face of the planet. All of those things are the things of the past. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. We're past war to
end all wars. Yeah,
we overestimate how much we're not going to worry about that. Barack Obama, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he says, "What? They don't realize it's the 21st century now. I mean, war is a thing of the past. Those rubes, So we have these aspirations that we've gone beyond these things, and now we're going to conquer the summer. We're going to eliminate poverty in our generation. That's what Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs said. We've done all these great things. We've gone to the moon. What are we going to do next? We're going to eliminate poverty. And so we take our eye off the ball of societal cohesion, of making sure that fairness is happening across the board, that we take our eye off the fundamentals and we put our focus on things that are far out there, and the fundamentals fall apart and we miss our goals up here. And then we start to become disillusioned. Whatever. I'm in it for myself. We couldn't solve poverty, but I'm just going to get rich. Now we're in the 80s. I'm just going to get rich. Well, so it happens that way over and over again.
And Lyndon Johnson is probably the best example I could think of in this cycle since World War II of somebody who we overestimated them having values in alignment with the collective of the country and aiming to do, quote unquote, the right thing. What we all kind of generally say the right thing. And I would argue he was the beginning of the end of what we're facing now, because the way he spoke about and the actions he took towards people he was, quote unquote, helping behind closed doors. If you could peel back a person's soul, he's the guy in the last 100 years I would think of would be the darkest soul of anybody who had a tremendous amount of influence. Who really spoke about helping people but did more damage to
generations,
an ethnicity and a generation of just obliterating their ability to prosper. And again, when I say this happening for decades before we became aware of it, you picked the perfect example I could pick of somebody who started undermining this and getting that pendulum motor going years before we were even aware that it was happening. He would be the guy.
And there's always people in that role historically, just like there's people in the role of what the book that you and I enjoy, The Fourth Turning. He talks about the gray champion, the person that comes in the crisis era, the elder statesman or whoever. But there's always those other roles as well of people that come along that they take advantage for personal gain or for power, and they speak well, but the reality of what they do, it's an ongoing pattern. And so the pendulum winds up and it winds down. and it's going to wind up again, and it's going to wind down again. And that's the story of humanity.
Yeah. And tribalism fits in a big piece of that. So, hey, as we've mentioned before, you've heard us say this time and time again, our goal here is just to kind of illustrate to somebody or chronicle to somebody living, as a middle-aged person in the year 2090-ish, what this moment in time is like. So if you think there's a piece that we're not explaining correctly, if you got a different perspective on what this moment feels like to you, if you think Dave and I are full of crap and we're completely missing the boat, we'd love to hear your comments. You can jump on our Rumble channel where this video is being played. If you're listening on audio, you can check out the Rumble thing. If you're watching on Rumble, throw a comment in there. Tell us what we're getting right. Tell us what we're getting wrong. Our goal is not to be right in this case. It's just to explain to somebody what this moment in time is like. So check it out there on Rumble. Go to unsilentpodcast.com. Check it out there. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are and see what you think we're getting right. See what you think we're getting wrong. And until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.